75 years ago, in 1947, at the midnight of August 14th and 15th, India and Pakistan were born as independent sovereign nations. Just before the clock struck 12, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, gave his historic lecture, Tryst with Destiny, to the Constituent Assembly that had been elected the previous year in 1946. Pandit Nehru was sober, not jubilant. He began his speech in words and tone very similar to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech that had been given in 1863. Lincoln had said, "4 square and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Freedom is fragile." By 4 square and 7, Abraham Lincoln meant 87 years earlier, that is in 1776, when the American founders signed the Declaration of Independence. In a significant contrast, Nehruji could not refer to any specific moment in Indian history when he made his vague assertion that long years ago we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. What does it mean to make a tryst with destiny? Literally, the words mean that we made a secret deal with something that was destined for us. Who made this secret deal for India to become a free nation? When was this deal made? Nehruji could not specify which Indian had made this secret deal with destiny and when was it made. As we shall see, a deal was indeed made, but it was neither secret nor was it man-made. The deal had been articulated about 4,000 years earlier, around the time the Indus Valley civilization was just starting. Before exploring that divine plan to make India a nation and a great nation, let's take a few moments to listen to a part of Nehruji's historic speech.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
If you take the time to study Pandit Nehru's 1947 speech and compare it with Lincoln's 1863 speech, you will notice that Nehruji was as sober as Abraham Lincoln. Why? Because both the speeches were made in the middle of civil wars. The partition of British India into India and Pakistan is not called a civil war because it was gangs organized in the name of religions who were attacking helpless victims who could not defend themselves. The violence had been going on before Nehruji started speaking. Before the violence ended, 1 million Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had been butchered by their own neighbors. 10 to 15 million people had been made homeless. At least 700,000 women had been abducted. The religious or communal violence that had actually begun a year earlier on 16th August 1946. On that day, the Muslim League called for Direct Action Day. They were attempting to pressurize the British government to partition the subcontinent into two nations, India and Pakistan. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of Muslim League, was a highly educated person, but he proclaimed that he wanted either a divided India or a destroyed India. The violence that began a year earlier spilled beyond Calcutta. In Calcutta itself, more Muslims were killed than Hindus, but in the Muslim majority district of Noakhali, the Muslim mobs massacred Hindus. That brutality had forced Mahatma Gandhi to spend several months in 1946 and made Noakhali his temporary base. He attempted to reconcile the warring communities, and he promised to return in August 1947 when everyone expected that vulnerable Hindus will be killed, and Mahatma Gandhi was willing to die for them or protect them. The 1946 brutality forced a reluctant Congress party and the British rulers to see that religion had already partitioned our hearts. Therefore, they were forced to agree to partition the land itself. In his Gettysburg Address, Lincoln had declared that civil war was testing whether freedoms and nationhoods will survive in the USA. Given the sinfulness of the human heart, no one should take peace and unity for granted in a family, in an organization, or in a nation itself. The subcontinent's partition exposed the spirituality of hate that masqueraded as religion. The partition's ghastly tragedy was only a prelude. Within a quarter century, our twin, Pakistan, was split into two nations, Pakistan and Bangladesh. India went through its own regional and national emergencies. Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, followed by assassination of our Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, in 1984, and Rajiv Gandhi in 1991. A people torn apart with hate-filled turmoil in 1947 needed a calming balm, words of comfort and hope, inspiration for future. Pandit Nehru succeeded in delivering the words that were needed at that moment, even if his propositions were not quite true or helpful for the future of India. This lecture will look at the major mistakes that Pandit Nehru made. Thankfully, in 1950, the Constituent Assembly to which Nehruji gave the speech itself rejected Nehru's main philosophical error. In his speech, Nehru, the Free India's new ruler, asked the nation to revere Mahatma Gandhi as the father of the nation. He said, "On this day, our first thoughts go to the architect of this freedom, the father of our nation, who, embodying the old spirit of India, held aloft the torch of freedom and lighted up the darkness that surrounds us. We have often been unworthy followers of his, and we have strayed away from his message, but not only but succeeding generations will remember his message and bear the imprint in their hearts of this great son of India, magnificent in his faith and strength and courage and humility. We shall never allow that torch of freedom to be blown out, however high the wind or stormy the tempest. Now, Gandhi, designated as the nation's father by Pandit Nehru, was conspicuous by his absence. Why wasn't he celebrating the birth of his baby? Well, the Mahatma was in Calcutta mourning the savagery of the Indian heart, wondering if the Quit India movement that he had launched was premature. Had India matured enough spiritually to govern itself with peace and justice? Under the colonial rule, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived together in relative peace. They were able to trust their neighbors because they trusted their colonial rulers, their civil servants, their police, and their judicial system. Ordinary citizens were able to count upon the colonial government to be just, to govern according to the written down law of the land, not according to caste, creed, connections, or bribes. Ordinary people were able to trust the free press, which had been nurtured during the colonial era. But now, as colonialism was ending, the neighbors were gripped by distrust and mutual hate. Even though there were many good Hindus who protected Muslims and many good Muslims who shielded their Hindu neighbors, notwithstanding those wonderful exceptions, the depressing mood that tormented Mahatma Gandhi and the nation at that moment of India's birth was inspired by simple fear. Will law and justice that the British gave to India depart with them? The American Civil War that Lincoln faced in the 1860s had taken 87 years to erupt. Even after America declared human equality and freed itself from British colonialism, the abomination of slavery had remained entrenched in many Christian hearts. The American government had to be realistic and permit slavery to remain legal until Lincoln's time. The Civil War erupted because the mutual hatred had simmered, even if the flame was invisible. Nehru's speech was magnificent, yet fear and hatred set Indian subcontinent aflame in 1946-47 because, as a humanist and agnostic, Nehru, like Jinnah, was far too superficial to understand a disease that was spiritual at its core. The fire of hatred was still simmering. Today, there are stronger reasons to fear that the subcontinent will burn again. And we, the people, have no Mahatmas who will risk their lives to stand up for our sanity and security. In 1954, Bollywood's most famous male singer, Muhammad Rafi, communicated to my generation the anguish of the leaders that actually witnessed India's independence and partition. The song, composed after Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, was included in Satyen Bose's film Jagrati.
हम लाए हैं तूफान से किश्ती निकाल के, इस देश को रखना मेरे बच्चों संभाल के। हम लाए हैं तूफान से किश्ती निकाल के, इस देश को रखना मेरे बच्चों संभाल के। तुम ही भविष्य हो मेरे भारत विशाल के, इस देश को रखना मेरे बच्चों संभाल के। हम लाए हैं तूफान से किश्ती निकाल के, इस देश को रखना मेरे बच्चों संभाल के।
It said, हम लाए हैं तूफान से किश्ती निकाल के, इस देश को रखना मेरे बच्चों संभाल के. We brought the boat out of the storm. Do take care of this country, my children. One of the stanzas in this poem said, एटम बमों के जोर पे बैठी है ये दुनिया, बारूद के एक ढेर पर बैठी है ये दुनिया. This world is sitting on atom bombs and on a dump of gunpowders. The world is, the song pleads that take care of every step you take. तुम हर कदम उठाना जरा देखभाल के, इस देश को रखना मेरे बच्चों संभाल के. हम लाए हैं तूफान से किश्ती निकाल के, इस देश को रखना मेरे बच्चों संभाल के. We've brought the boat out of storms. Do take care of this country, my children. In the 1950s, Kavi Pradeep's poetic line that the world sits on the edge of atom bomb and gunpowder was prophetic. Everyone knew that independence had turned India and Pakistan into enemies who did not love their neighbors as themselves. But no one imagined back then that these enemies will soon acquire atom bombs capable of mutual self-destruction. The poet was thinking primarily of nuclear rivalry that was developing between a democratic USA and a despotic USSR. It is right to celebrate 75 years of India's independence. Many of our infrastructural achievements are magnificent. We are able to export not just food and pharma, but also world-class leaders of institutions, businessmen, engineers, doctors, educators, managers, economists, thinkers, writers, and artists. India's political stability is something to be grateful for. We are the world's largest constitutional democratic republic. A generation ago, statesmen such as Winston Churchill did not think that we were capable of governing ourselves. But thanks to the visionary leaders such as Nehru, Patel, and Ambedkar, India has proven the doubters wrong. Most colonies that became free nations after World War II did go through bloody civil wars, coups, assassinations, and violent overthrows of governments and constitutions. In 1971, India's twin brother split into two nations, Bangladesh and Pakistan. Only one of Pakistan's elected presidents has achieved a full 5-year term in office, but not a single prime minister there has been so fortunate. India's political success deserves celebration. Experts will no doubt contrast India's economic stagnation with China's relative success. Many will discuss the educational failure of India compared to South Korea or Israel. This lecture has time only to focus on a few fundamental but neglected issues on which Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was confused and misled India in very important ways. Nehru and his followers built dams, canals, roads, universities, factories, and armies. But they failed to nurture the soul, cultivate wisdom and virtue. These are the true wealth of any nation. Let's begin by asking, why was Mahatma Gandhi fasting and mourning on that jubilant occasion of colonialism's end and the birth of a new nation that crowned him as its father? On August 15, 1947, Mahatma Gandhi was in Calcutta in Hyderabad Manzil, which was an abandoned home of a Muslim family that had fled in fear. The home is in Beliaghata, near a predominantly Muslim majority slum. Gandhiji was staying with the former Muslim Premier of Bengal, Mr. Sohrawardi. Why? On August 6th in 47, Gandhiji was in Lahore. He boarded the Calcutta mail to go across from west to east in order to reach Noakhali district in East Bengal, because he had promised to protect the Hindus or to die with them around the 15th of August 1947. When he reached Calcutta on August 9th, some prominent Muslim pleaded with Gandhiji to stay with them in Calcutta and protect Muslims from Hindu mobs. They argued that hatred has grown over the previous 12 months. Hindus and Muslims have prepared themselves for the worst imaginable violence against each other. In Calcutta, Hindus outnumbered Muslims. If there were atrocities against Muslims, the rumors, true and false, will spread all over Bengal, and that would make matters much worse against Hindus in Noakhali, where Gandhi was going, and in other parts of East Bengal, which was to become East Pakistan. Mahatma Gandhi himself will be trapped in Pakistan on 15th of August, and the police might not be as respectful towards him as the colonial officers had been when they arrested political prisoners. Gandhiji agreed to this request on the condition that they would do all that they can to persuade Muslims in Noakhali to protect the minority Hindu neighbors. Now, I have to cut this long and tragic story short. It climaxed with Mahatma Gandhi's assassination on 30th January 1948 while he was in a prayer meeting. He was killed not by British colonialists, not by Muslim jihadists, but he was killed by India's own homegrown spirituality of hate. We have to be sober as we celebrate India's 75th anniversary, because today India has no Gandhi, but it has plenty of pundits and politicians who are proud of their spirit that is filled with hatred. It is easy to blame them, but in my opinion, the blame game needs to begin by recognizing Pandit Nehru's spiritual failure. Nehruji was a great man. He was a genuine patriot. He spent 9.5 years in jail to win India's freedom. In his influential pre-independence writings, he repeatedly branded himself as a communist, socialist, materialist who had little respect for the spiritual foundations of a nation's success or failure. He was deceived by Western intellectuals who believed in economic determinism of Karl Marx. Progress, according to his worldview, was a matter of money, not of spirit. Nehru's materialistic worldview was expressed in his assertion that long years ago we made a tryst with destiny. The Constituent Assembly, which heard Nehru's speech, actually rejected his humanistic assertion. On January 24, 1950, it adopted Rabindranath Tagore's song Jan Gan Man Adhinayak Jai Hai as our national anthem. Tagore had composed his lyric in 1911, that is a generation before Nehru became a leader. At that time, modern education was still shaped by biblical worldview that God and his providence shapes history. Tagore's lyric conveyed a foundational truth that Nehru and his followers chose to ignore. That truth is that God, not man, is the dispenser of India's history. Tagore translated his lyric from Bengali into English, and it says, "Thou art the ruler of the minds of all people, dispenser of India's destiny, Bharat Bhagya Vidhata. Thy name rouses the hearts of the Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat, Maratha, Dravida, Utkal, Banga. They pray for thy blessings and sing thy praise. The saving of all people waits in thy hand, thou dispenser of India's destiny. Jai ho, Jai ho, Jai ho. Victory, victory, victory to thee." Who made India's tryst with destiny? It was God who promised Abraham 4,000 years ago. He called Abraham to walk with me, and in exchange, God said that I will bless you, I will make you a great nation, because through your seed, I want to bless all the nations. That seed referred to the Messiah. God repeated his promise to bless all the nations, including India, to Abraham's son Isaac and grandson Jacob. It was that divine promise that was being fulfilled in Indian history on the midnight of August 14th, 15th, 1947. Now, you don't believe that, do you? And why don't you believe it? Well, because no historian ever says so, although every Indian does actually affirm that truth when he or she sings the national anthem. Well, who is right? The agnostic historians or the national anthem? In my 1997 book, India the Grand Experiment, I presented the case that modern India is a grand experiment envisioned and executed largely by British evangelicals. This book is now being reprinted in Cambridge this year. My earlier book, The Legacy of William Carey, will also be published this year with a new title, The Father of Modern India, William Carey. He is the true father of modern India. Currently, about 30 of us are giving finishing touches to a new book, How the Bible Created Modern India. It should also be published within the next few months. God enabling, out of that research will flow a number of documentaries that will correct the corrupted view of Indian history. Uh, why is this important? Because Nehru's own book, The Discovery of India, would not have been written without William Carey's newspaper, Friend of India, which continues till today as Sunday Statesman. Nehru might have written a book, The Discovery of Hindustan or The Discovery of Bharat. The name India, the concept of India as a nation, political nation state, came from the Bible. These are Jewish ideas which came through Protestant movement all over Europe, and then through English language they came to India. Now, Nehru's generation derailed the divine mission to transform India into a great nation. We need God's grace to put that train back on track. Now, do I hear you say that I don't have time for this nonsense? Well, if so, may I ask you a few questions? Jawaharlal Nehru was a Kashmiri Pandit. Why didn't he give his speech in Sanskrit? Why in English? Why not in Persian, which was Delhi's court language when Britain made it its own capital? Oh, you say that Nehru lectured in English because of Lord Macaulay, who had decided that the East India Company should educate India's future leader in English medium. Well, you are absolutely right. What many people do not know is that Jawaharlal Nehru went to study in the same King's College in Cambridge, where Macaulay had studied 90 years before him. Also, do you know that both Pandit Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi studied law at the Inner Temple in London in order to practice the law that the Lord Macaulay gave to us as Indian Penal Code, IPC. The Inner Temple where they studied was built by the Knight Templars. During 12th and 13th century, every single law professor there was a clergyman ordained by the church. He was priest. The partition violence was a result of the common man's fear that independent India might lose the law, which was and continues to be the source of India's peace and justice. The law that Gandhi and Nehru had studied had come from the womb of God's word. Equally important, the tryst with destiny that Nehru mentioned in his speech had actually been articulated by the same Lord Macaulay in 1833 before the House of Commons. He had urged British government to bless India, not loot India, to pursue a policy that would produce Indian leaders such as Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar. Let us look at the concluding part of Macaulay's magnificent manifesto for India's freedom that he presented to British Parliament. He said, "Are we to keep the people of India ignorant in order that we may keep them submissive? Or do we think that we can give them knowledge without awakening ambition? Or do we mean to awaken ambition and to provide it with no legitimate vent?" Who will answer any of these questions in the affirmative? Yet one of them must be answered in the affirmative by every person who maintains that we ought permanently to exclude the natives from high office. "I have no fear," said Macaulay. "The path of duty is plain before us." Duty to India or duty to God? The path of duty is plain before us. And it is also the path of wisdom of national prosperity, of national honor. The destinies of our Indian empires are covered with thick darkness. It is difficult to form any conjecture as to the fate reserved for a state which resembles no other in history and which forms by itself a separate class of political phenomenon. The laws which regulate its growth and decay are still unknown to us. It may be that the public mind of India may expand under our system till it has outgrown that system, that by good government we may educate our subjects into a capacity for better government, that having become instructed in European knowledge, they may in some future age demand European institutions such as Parliament. Whether such a day will ever come, I know not, said Macaulay, but never shall I attempt to avert or retard it. Whenever it comes, it will be the proudest day in English history to have found a great people sunk in the lowest depths of slavery to the Mughal Empire and superstition, to have so ruled them as to have made them desirous and capable of all the privileges of citizens would indeed be a title to glory all our own. The scepter may pass away from us. Unforeseen accidents may derange our most profound schemes of policy. Victory may be inconsistent to our arms, but there are triumphs which are followed by no reverses. There is an empire, the kingdom of God, exempt from all natural causes of decay. Those triumphs are the pacific triumphs of reason, logos, over barbarism. That empire is the imperishable empire of our arts and our morals, our literature and our laws. When Lord Macaulay came to India to give us the law that still governs us, the IPC, he lived with his sister Hannah and her husband Sir Charles Trevelyan, who had risked his life to oppose corruption in the British East India Company. In 1838, that is 5 years after Macaulay's speech to the British Parliament arguing for India's independence, Trevelyan explained the purpose of Christian education. In his book, The Education of the People of India, Trevelyan wrote, "The existing connection between two such distant countries as England and India cannot, in the nature of things, be permanent. No effort of policy can prevent the natives from ultimately regaining their independence. But there are two ways of arriving at this point. One of this is through the medium of revolution, like the French Revolution. The other through that of reform. Revolution must end in complete alienation of mind and separation of interest between ourselves and the natives. The other, reform, will end in a permanent alliance founded on mutual benefit and goodwill. The only means, Trevelyan says, for preventing revolution in India and securing the results of reform is to set the natives on a process of European improvement. The natives will have independence after first learning how to make use of it, and we shall exchange profitable subjects with still more profitable allies trained by us to happiness and independence. And endowed with our learning and political institutions, India will remain the proudest monument of British benevolence. This is 1838, way before Mahatma Gandhi was born. This lecture cannot take the time to point out that men such as Macaulay and Trevelyan were protégés of the prophet of modern India, who is Charles Grant. He is the one who envisioned modernization of India. The missionaries, hundreds of thousands of missionaries who implemented their vision, followed William Carey, who is the true father of modern India. Leaders of independent India, such as Nehru and Ambedkar, knew the spirituality of love that had created modern India, even if they did not believe that providence was guiding Indian history. They doubted, as skeptics, that God had sent hundreds of thousands of his children to serve India as missionaries and civil servants and engineers and military officials, and they had gone on to create modern India. These children of Abraham's faith brought to India the worldview which ensured that Pandit Nehru did not become India's emperor. It was the Messiah, the King of Kings, who washed his disciples' feet, who taught Pandit Nehru to become India's first servant, the Prime Minister. Nehru knew Britain better than today's politicians do. That's why he chose to keep India a member of British Commonwealth and ensured, along with Dr. Ambedkar and others, that India would adopt Britain's Westminster system of government. The Constituent Assembly that heard Pandit Nehru's speech was elected by the people in 1946. It knew, what our forthcoming book will explain, that freely elected elders governing a nation is God's idea. It was the Bible that has shaped many essential features of modern Britain and India. And if our pundits find it hard to confess that truth, the original Independence Day, 1947, exposed the darkness of human heart that has corrupted Indian education, civil services, police, financial, and judicial systems, as well as the modern press, postmodern press. Darkness is once again engulfing the Indian subcontinent because our leaders have turned away from God's word, which is the light of our path and lamp of our feet. We need to return individually and as a nation to God's light before the spirituality of hate blows up all our achievements of the last 75 years into mushroom clouds that will cover the entire subcontinent. God bless India.